Let's talk a little bit about applications to start with here. I have been asked the question many times over time, why on earth do I have to complete an application that has my contact information and my experience and my skills and my education? And then I also have to make a resume and submit it that has my contact information and my experience and my skills and my education. Are they being mean? Why are they doing this? Why do I need to do both? And the reason for that is that one of them is a form created by the employer that's more of a legal document that they have to provide. The other is a marketing document created by you. So the two have different roles in the application process. Sometimes you might not even have the same person looking at each document. So that's something to keep in mind as you're working with your applications. So this is a really quick rundown of applications. If you happen to attend last week, you got a little bit more of a deep dive. But some good best practices for applications to keep in mind are one, to read through the instructions and as much of the application as possible to see what you're in for as you're going through it. Uh, the reality is that many applications are online right now, and sometimes you'll be able to see the whole thing, and other times you will only be able to see the current page and not really be able to see what's coming up. So within the bounds of reality, but the more you can tell about what you need to prepare, that way you know what you can expect and how much time you might need to allot. And that's a good thing to keep in mind, how much time you might need. Don't short yourself on how much time. Don't try to squeeze in an application before going to do something important because some applications are really quick and some of them are really not. Plus, you would want to make sure you have time to target your resume, which we will talk about, and to make sure that if they have an option to provide a cover letter, that you are drafting one of those too, which we will also talk about. So keep in mind that you might want to allow some time to reduce some stress. If you can, try to fill out everything on the application. Even if there are questions that are not applicable to you, if possible, just put in NA or not applicable. So that way the employer knows you saw that question and it just doesn't apply to you rather than, oh, they forgot this question. Oh, they skipped it. Then that way they don't know. So that way you can erase any question marks from the equation there. I would also recommend reading the small print at the end. If you have completed a lot of applications, you might be familiar with a big old block of text that is often toward the end of an application. It is often pretty small and pretty dense and seems to shout, I am very boring, please skip me, don't worry about it. Don't listen to that voice. It's important to make sure you're reading the small print when you can. And the reason for that is that even if you are applying online and you are typing your signature or drawing your signature, that is equivalent to writing your signature in ink. So general best practice, make sure you know what you're signing. And finally, it is important to keep good records. My goodness, if there is any tip that I will provide to someone to reduce headaches in an active job application process, it is that. Keep good records. Most employers, if you are applying through company websites, will each have you make a username and a password. They are each going to have slightly different criteria for that password. And it is a pain to try and keep track, especially if you are applying for several positions quite regularly. So, what I'd recommend is either on paper, on a spreadsheet, however you like to work with information, that you keep track of the date you applied, the company name that you applied for, the job title. So those three important, along with the username and password, if that is part of that process. So that way you know exactly which username and password you're using for each company that you're applying for. And then any additional information that will be helpful. That could be a job ID associated with the position you applied for. That could be a security question or three that you had to make. And that way you can keep track of this is the security question that I picked, and this is exactly how I typed it. Because a great way to lose a bunch of time in your day is to not remember that and not remember if your answer to the question was St. Paul with Saint spelled out or St. Paul with an ST period or an ST with no period and space or no space. Headache city. So I would encourage you to keep good records and it'll make life much easier as you're going through your process. And finally, you want to remember that the application is one of the first impressions you're going to leave with the employer. There are going to be some people working with that employer for whom this is the first thing they know about you, the first thing they see about you. So you want to make a good impression. And I would encourage you, like I said, this is a really quick skim of applications, but I'd encourage you to connect with your nearest career force. And if you want to kind of sit down and talk with somebody further about any questions related to applications, because I've seen many things with applications, and some of them are wild. And so if you are coming up against something you did not expect in an application process, that's a great opportunity to talk with one of the career counselors at our offices. Um, I think I see some questions coming up in the chat about applications, which we can address briefly. Um, and Sheila, did you see some coming up as well? We might have lost Sheila.
No,
Oh,
I'm
you're here.
I haven't seen any specifically about applications since you started. There might have been some earlier when they were putting in what they want to learn. So I'll go back and check that.
Okay, gotcha. Well, we will come back to any questions if we have time. But I appreciate your engagement, folks. So we have talked a little bit about applications, so let's get into the big topic, resumes. We are going to be covering quite a lot of sides of the resume today. And so the hope is that after you have completed this section and this workshop, that you are comfortable with key basics about resumes, including what are the basic sections to have, what are some basic formatting tips, which some of you may be familiar with already, but then also what are some more advanced formatting choices available to you? What does good targeting look like for your resume, and why is that important? And how to utilize an accomplishment statement in your bullet points and how that can give your resume impact. And finally, once we have talked about resumes, we are going to be talking very briefly about cover letters, what basic content to include, and why. So, when you have discussed resumes with people, my guess is that if you have talked to 5 different people about resumes, you may have gotten at least 10 different opinions about what makes a resume good. The reason for that is that there's no exact formula to resume writing. One thing that works well for one person could be the absolute wrong choice for someone else, depending on their work history and depending on what they are looking to do next in their career. And so that's something to keep in mind. What I'm going to do and what Career Force staff will do is offering best practices and strategy advice. And so just keep in mind, some things will work really well for one person and not so well for someone else. So pick and choose for what works best for you, because the most important thing is that you're comfortable with your resume. You want to be able to confidently sell your skills and background when you're interviewing, when you're networking. This is your document. And so I would encourage you to keep in mind as you're going through, if you are kind of being told to make your resume a certain way and you go, I don't feel like this represents me quite the way I want to be, it's your document. And so you can make changes. But when you do find conflicting advice, which you will, about resumes, the first thing I'd recommend asking yourself is about the context. Is this advice directed to a job seeker of a specific industry or with a certain work background or with a certain career goal? And then second, ask, is this what's right for me? Ultimately, once you're comfortable with your resume and confident with it, the only test for it is it getting you interviews for positions you are interested in? If it's getting you interviews for positions for which you are wildly overqualified or underqualified, it's not quite doing its job. If it's not getting you interviews and you're just hearing crickets after you submit it, it's definitely not doing its job yet. And so it is doing its job when you are getting interviews for positions you are interested in. So, after I have just spoken a lot about how no resume needs to be this one thing, let's talk about some things that most resumes still probably should be. So, we have a nice acronym for it and everything. So, regarding resumes, you want them to be a review of your qualifications for a job posting or a specific occupation or industry. If someone walked up to you on the street and said, "Tell me your qualifications," you would very reasonably probably have questions like, my qualifications for what? For data analysis? For monster truck driving? For juggling? What do you mean? And that's something to keep in mind for your resume. It's not a general document. You want it to be as focused as you can. And you will hear me coming back to that word focus, because that is the key of targeting a resume. So you want it to be focused on your qualifications for a given position or for a given field. And the way that you can focus it is by including the essential information only. Only items that help market you to the employer. Oh, items that make a case for you for this position. And so you can do that by highlighting different skills that, based on the job description, when you are targeting your resume, which we'll talk about a little more, you want to make that job description your best friend. Let it be your guide for what you highlight from your experience. So you want it to be about the accomplishments that you made using the skills that made you good at your job and the skills that you see will be used for this position you're applying for. Ultimately, you want it to be focusing on what makes you unique as well. It's one thing to list tasks that were assigned to you. It's another thing to have a list of accomplishments of here is how well I did this task and here was the result. That's an accomplishment statement. We're going to talk about it a little later, but that can make a huge difference in how your resume markets your skills. Because ultimately, that's what it's doing. You're marketing yourself. It is your marketing tool. And that was something that was a light bulb moment when I first heard it, thinking of a resume not as just a list of your previous experience and skills, it is your marketing tool. And so that is why we recommend targeting it, because the way you market something to one person might be different than how you market it to someone else. What makes a resume effective, like I said, is it gets you interviewed. Another thing that most effective resumes have is a nice appearance, that they're quick and easy to read. And finally, you want it to be specific. You want it to show why are you the best fit for this position? Rather than answering the question, what is everything you've done before in your professional life? You want to make sure your resume is answering the question, how well do you match this position? So, as far as more basics with the resume go, you to that end of a lot of the things mentioned on the previous slide, it's not a complete history. This is a preview. You want to think of your resume as kind of a movie trailer, just enough to get the employer interested. You don't want to put the whole movie in the trailer. So that way the employer sees, yes, this person's qualified. I want to know more. You want that resume to be a quick and easy read. You don't want it to be super dense, with you want it to have clear sections. And so you ultimately just want it to be a quick couple of minutes a glance, and that person, whoever is looking at your resume, will know I see exactly how this person fits with the job description. I see why this person with their job history applied for this position. Let's move them forward. And ultimately, remember that your resume is a living document. Once you have finished it, that's not, I wash my hands of this. I have a resume now. It's never changing again. You may change it rather often, and it will change based on the positions you're applying for, based on your career goals, based on your skills as you develop them. And so be ready to change it and update it to make sure that it's representing you as you move forward. Actually, before we go into that wild little slide I just went to, any questions that are coming up in the chat?
Yes, we do have a few. And I found the one on the application that you probably
Oh,
saw that went by. Someone was asking, why do they ask your gender on an application? Sometimes you don't have the option to select I do not wish to answer.
there should always be an option to select that to either say, I don't wish to answer, or it's just not required to answer that question. The reason it's there is that it's part of an Equal Opportunity Commission survey. And so it's separate from the form that the employer created in order to screen for the position. Employers are required to include that equal opportunity employment screening as well, which is why you'll often see those questions clumped together, gender, ethnicity, race, disability status, possibly veteran status. And so those should always have the option to not answer if you choose not to. So either it will be, if it's a required question, there should be an option to say, I don't want to answer, or it's not a required question. If they're not letting you not answer that, then they're doing something wrong. So I hope that you're not seeing that too often.
Right. Okay. And the other questions are about formats and work history. So we'll just wait and see if you answer those along the way. Okay.
Okay, yes, we will be talking formats very soon. Okay, let's get back to this interesting slide here. It's one of my favorite slides, and let me tell you what on earth you're looking at here. So this image comes from a study that was done by theladders.com. They used some fancy technology to show the heat from a recruiter's eyeballs as they moved over to resumes. And so when you are looking at these documents where you see the red and the yellow, that's where they spent a lot of time looking. There was more heat there. The blue is some. And then if you don't see any color, that means that they were not looking at that spot. And so I would like to see just briefly in the chat, what do you notice about these two resumes, about either one of them? And I know you can't really see the content of them, but you can see the format and kind of how it's set up. So what do you notice about the formats, and what do you notice about how kind of the patterns of how those recruiters looked at those resumes? See, education appears to be a focus. The top is interesting. The text blocks get ignored. Yes. Um, got formatting and header. They spent more time on the second resume. Oh my goodness, you guys are awake today. I love it. Um, that if it, let's see, very dense on the second one. Left side heavy eyes. Oh my gosh, you guys are going fast. It's going off the screen before I can read it, but beautiful. Yes, so you're noticing many things about these. So as far as the patterns of where the recruiter was looking, you might notice on the left side here, I have a little laser pointer I can use. On the left side here, we've got a lot of attention up toward the top and some in the middle, and then we get down here to this large block of text and nothing. This is a great big block, and a lot of times our eyes don't like that, especially if we are trying to read something quickly. And what you might also notice is that these have quite wide margins, and so a lot of the text looks kind of clumped together. I see one is more enlisted and one is in paragraph form. And you're right. Over here, this is a little bit more list heavy. You can see the bullet points, and this one also has bullet points, but because the margins are so wide, it looks like a lot more dense text. This is more clear and separate sections and more spaced out text. And what you can see is that this is not a line, like an entire page of red. Neither of these are that. That's not how our brains work. But these are being scanned and they're looking for keywords for those positions. They are looking for information that is going to be relevant to that position that they're hiring for. So speaking of keywords and making things scannable, I saw in the icebreaker at the beginning here that there was some interest in applicant tracking software, or ATS. If you have not heard that term before, that is software that a lot of employers utilize as kind of the first step of screening applications before any person looks at the application. And so it will scan for keywords. It will scan to see, is this a match, or is this enough of a match to then move on to the person who would be looking at the resume next. And so not all employers utilize them, but a lot do. So what are some ways you can make this scannable by that software? Well, the good news is a lot of things that make something scannable by software also are what help it be scannable for a person. If you're using fancy fonts that have a lot of curly cues or are a little bit non-standard, that might be a little bit harder for someone's eyes to process very quickly. It also sometimes can be misread by scanning software. If you are using a big modern format that is very visual oriented, but maybe not very straightforward as far as how things are laid out, sometimes that can be confusing for someone who's looking at it if it's not very clearly laid out. It can also be confusing for a computer because it'll go, wait, what's where? What am I looking for here? And so keeping it simple with your formatting is a good practice to have when you know it's going to be going through applicant tracking software, which if you're applying online, it probably is. Sometimes you would have the opportunity to do some research on specific types of ATS. When you are applying online, then you might click apply now and then notice that you are no longer on the employer's website. In the web address, you will see a different one, like ICIMS is a common one, or Workday, and that is the applicant tracking system. And so you can Google that and you can learn a little bit more about what would be helpful, what not to do with your resume. There's also an excellent website called jobscan.co, jobscan.co. And Sheila, maybe we can put this in the follow-up email. But that website has some great articles and tips specifically about dealing with and navigating applicant tracking software. And they have an excellent tool there where you can put in your resume, copy and paste a job description, click a button, and then you will be able to see what is the percentage match between my resume as it is and this job description, as an ATS might see it. So it's a very cool tool. I would recommend it if that's a focus. So you will see many resume templates. They might use various formats. Some of those might be listed as formats to avoid. There are some formats out that will go out of their way to say this is ATS friendly. So you can keep an eye out for those as well. I've noticed that about some that are some of the formats that are available through Google Docs. They'll specify they're ATS friendly. So that's something to keep an eye out for. Just make sure that ultimately you want to keep it simple, keep your fonts simple, keep your format simple. And that doesn't mean that don't make it look good, because you certainly can, but it does mean that try to avoid going way too out there when you are formatting your resume. All right, so going from there, the reason that we say as well to not get too caught up in wild formats is that you don't want to have any distraction from the content, because the content is the most important part of the resume. And what should that content be? Ultimately, you want it to be honest and positive. If you have inaccurate information on the resume, that could cause some problems for you later on. So always be honest information, always have positive information there. Focus on skills and things you've achieved or accomplished, not just the tasks that you performed. Employers are interested in results. And again, that's an accomplishment statement. Going from a task, I was responsible for this, versus an accomplishment statement. I I did this task in this way and had this result. And so again, focusing the resume on a particular skill or a particular occupation can really help as far as helping the employer see you in that position and imagine you doing that work. And so if you try to include all of your experience and skills, you make it harder for the employer to do that, because they have to kind of sort through some of the areas that might be impressive but less relevant to find what is most relevant to the position. So that is something to keep in mind with targeting. That could look like even if you have a wealth of experience and you have had a very rich career in several different areas, that doesn't necessarily mean that if you're applying for a position at a restaurant that you're going to put your forklift certification on your resume, unless that position requires you to go in the back and use a forklift to get bulk items down from large shelves. So keep in mind, always, always, always use the job description as your guide. And finally, we talked a little bit about keywords. Keywords are important. Yes, the software can look for them, but it also can be very helpful to use the language that you see for how the job description talks about things. If I have been a trainer for X number of years and I see a position I'm interested in and the position is for a facilitator, and I see that means the same thing, that they just call it a facilitator, I will be introducing myself as a facilitator. That is a way to just make it very easy for the dots to be connected between your position, what you've done before, and the position you're applying for. Now let's talk very briefly about overqualification as well. If any of you have gotten feedback at the resume stage, right, the interview stage is a different thing. We'll be focusing on that next week. But at the resume stage, if you are getting feedback that you are overqualified for the positions that you are interested in, that might mean that it's time to take a second look at it and see if you can target it further. Because if someone looks at a resume and says overqualified, that might mean that some of the information on the resume indicates that you are focusing on a different position than the one that you are interested in. And so that can be difficult to do, because often, rightly so, we are proud of all that we've achieved, even if it's not directly related to this position we're applying for. But that's not the role of the resume. The resume is answering the question, how well do you match this position? And so you always want to be keeping an eye on the resume to make sure that, is this still fitting the job description of what I'm applying for? Is this still answering that question? All right, we are going to go into formats here in a moment. Any questions on previous sections before we jump in?
Well, we still have lots of questions on work history and formatting.
Oh, well, you
Yeah.
are in luck. We are about to go right into it.
Yeah, there's a question here. If a former employer uses Workday and you were fired, is any bad information from former employers visible to the new employer? Are you aware of that, Vanessa?
Not that I'm aware of. I don't believe, as far as I know, employers wouldn't be using application tracking software in that way. Um, I, is that not that I'm aware of? Sheila, are you aware of anything like that?
I am not. No.
No, I don't believe that that's something that would be publicly available or available through that kind of software. That might be if you put somebody in, as a reference and it was from a position that ended negatively, it's up to them what they say about it. So then that's not something you can control. But right in the software, that's not something I've ever heard of.
Okay. And then you were talking about you focusing on your skills. Someone is saying that job descriptions are pages long now. Should we focus on the top 5 skills or look for the hardest 5 to address in our resume if we fit all?
Oh, okay. Well, so step one that I love doing is just because I'm a pencil and paper gal, is to print out that job description, take a highlighter to it, and see. Okay, I got this. I've got this. I've done this. I haven't done that. I have done that. And so keeping track of what you've done. If you have found that you have highlighted basically the entire document, then yes, it might be a matter of you could use a T table, which some of you might have heard of if you've attended other workshops with us. It basically is drawing a big T, and then on one side you list the requirements from the job description, and on the other side you list kind of how your skills or your experience addresses them. So I think that going with the top 5 that you see the most, or the top 5 that seem most relevant, it's up to you. You can also use a word cloud if you're familiar with those. I know that there is a URL, but it's not in my head right now. But if you just Google free word cloud website, and maybe Sheila knows one and is typing one in the chat, I'm not sure. But that way you can plug in the job description there, copy and paste it, and then it will immediately show you what are the words that come up the most often. Those will show up the largest. And so that can also guide you as far as, okay, where do I even start with focusing my resume? So there are a few different ways that you can go about it.
Okay. And I think we'll save the rest for later.
Okay. All right. Moving forward. Let's talk about formats. I skipped a slide. All right. So with resume formats, some basic things to keep in mind is that you want your resume format to best present your skills relative to the position that you're targeting. And so we're going to get into some specific formats that are out there. They're certainly not comprehensive, but in general, things to keep in mind, that top 1/3 of page 1 of your resume, if you have more than one page, is key. That top third is what the whoever's looking at your resume is most likely to look at, even if they don't have time to look at anything else. And so that is where you want to put your most important information. Generally, we recommend that being the place where you put your intention, which could look like a professional summary, it could look like an objective, it could look like a professional profile, whatever you want to call it. The place where you introduce yourself professionally and give a quick preview of how well you fit that position, that's what you want to put there. It's a way of saying, yes, I do fit the qualifications. Here's how. Read on. And so that can be really helpful to make sure that you are utilizing that space strategically. Another thing to keep in mind as you're going through the resume and you are formatting it is to make sure you've got areas of white space. Remember a couple slides back when there was the resume that had the big block of text at the bottom that the recruiter didn't even bother with. It is important to include white space because it allows us a place visually to breathe, if you will. And so it helps us to keep focused and to keep track of where we are on the document. When you don't have much white space or you're not utilizing it, then that's when you get those big blocks of text that seem to shout, I am very boring, please skip me. And you do not want any sections like that on your resume. And finally, as far as some details, generally would recommend to use bullet points rather than paragraphs. Our eyes like lists. To make sure that your margins are ideally between a 1/2 inch and an inch. If they are wider than that, then it starts looking like a very dense column. If they are narrower than that, then it can look like a wall of text. And so ideally 1/2 inch to an inch it is something to aim for. For font size, no smaller absolutely than size 10. I would say even if possible, avoid going smaller than size 12. You don't want the recruiter's primary memory of your resume to be the headache that they got trying to read it. So make sure that you are making it large enough that it can be easily read. You also don't need to utilize any space on your resume to say references available upon request. It was quite trendy to include this on resumes for quite a while, where it was just part of what you do on the resume, that you would stick it at the bottom and say, my references are available if you ask for them. That's no longer something that is as common on resumes. It's not something that you need to do. It's generally understood and implied that you'll provide resume references if asked. So you don't need to include it on your resume at this point. And a brief note on references, unless they are requested, you don't need to send them right away. Just start with the basics, whatever is requested for that application, unless the advertisement calls for something additional. And if they are requested, then I would say to place them on a separate document, but use the same name and contact information block that you've used on your cover letter and your resume. Anybody who attended last week will recognize that as branding your documents. Basically, making sure they all look like they belong to the same person, they all look like they're going to the same party. So let's zoom in to some specific resume formats. We'll be looking at 3 basic format types here that can work well for different situations. One is chronological, one is functional or skills-based, and one is a combination of those two. And so as you look at these, I'll talk through some situations that might make sense for someone to use each of these formats. And so you can get the gears turning. Again, these are not comprehensive. You can play with them. You can kind of figure out what tells your story best. But ultimately, target that resume, no matter what format you use. All right, so number 1 here is chronological resumes, and this format might look familiar to many of you because this is quite a traditional format. This was the go-to format for quite a long time, and it's still used pretty widely. The idea of a chronological resume is that it highlights your recent employment, puts less emphasis on jobs that you held longer ago. And so an example, Robert Doyle's resume here, you see we've got his contact information at the top, his summary in which he introduces himself as a production assembler, his selected skills and experience that most of which have to do with production assembly, his employment history in which he was a production assembler and a circuit board assembler, and his education, which includes soldering, which has to do with production assembly. And so really this entire document is singing a song about production assembly. And so that's a situation that works really well for a chronological format. It's great if you've got consistent employment history, if you've been kind of in the same field for a lot of your career, and that's also what you're applying for, kind of the next step up or the next step forward. And that can work really well because the spotlight is on look at my recent experience and how similar it is to what I am applying for. It's great if you don't have a lot of gaps in your employment as well, because then you can just see that timeline from earlier on to now. And so that can be great. It might not be as good of a fit if you are looking to change careers, or if you are a recent graduate, or if you have a longer gap in your work history for whatever reason. So those are some things to think about when you're looking at chronological resumes. It puts the spotlight on your recent work history. So it's great for you if that work history, if your recent history is consistent with your career goals. Something to keep in mind about length and how far back you should go. I've seen a couple questions about that. The rule of thumb that we recommend is to put the last 10 to 15 years of experience that you can put detail about, or the last 3 positions you've held, or something in between, whatever best tells your story. But once you get past 15 years, then there are some ways that you can go about formatting that. If you really have some experience and skills from before 15 or so years ago, and you want to make sure that those are honored on the resume, you can have a little section toward the bottom that says additional relevant experience and can just put a couple of sentences, a short summary of your collective experience prior to a certain date. So that way you can still include it, but we don't recommend going into a lot of detail with older positions because generally employers will think, well, are they still using these skills? Is this still relevant to them professionally? Is it relevant to me? And especially if you had similar experience or more involved experience since then, that's going to be what the employer is primarily interested in. So that's something to keep in mind. So that was a chronological resume. And I mentioned it might not be great for recent graduates in particular, but this format might be. So if you are early in your career or at the beginning of your career, then you might want to consider a functional resume or a skills-based resume. And so let's talk about how this differs a little bit from the chronological resume. We've still got our contact information at the top. We still have some version of an intention at the top. In this case, it's an objective. Last time it was a summary. And that this is more of a template, so you don't have a pretend person here, but it goes from there into kind of a summary of qualifications, some highlights. And then instead of going into work history, it goes into accomplishments and it's broken down by skill set. And so this could work really well if someone's early in their career, if there's not a lot of work history to write about yet, but have built great skills in an educational situation, in the community, in a volunteer situation, and so on. And so the nice thing about this format is that it's very flexible. You can really look at the job description and look at what are the skills that seem to be valued the most here. And those can be the ones you choose. So if that job description talks a lot about customer service, you can talk about your customer service experience. And this can work well regardless of your age or of your experience level, but especially if your primary experience for a position is not in traditional paid work experience. This can be a great way to keep the spotlight on, look what I can do. Look at how my skills fit this. The spotlight is not on, look at the most recent job I had. And so down here at the bottom, then it focuses on education, training, personal development. And so it's a way to still show, here are some things that I have been attached to, some things I've been associated with, places that I have built some of these skills. So that can be helpful, like I said, if you're early in the career, because it's pulling your skills and accomplishments together to answer the question, how well do you match this position? So if you're thinking, okay, the chronological resume doesn't work for me, but I am not at the beginning of my career. I'm looking to change careers, or for some other reason, this isn't a good fit. Do not worry. The combination resume might be a good fit. So let's take a look at this example here. Susan Pope. We've got our contact information at the top, pretty standard. Got a summary statement in which Susan introduces herself as an experienced security professional. From there, just like in the functional or skills-based resume, she goes into selected skills and experience based on what she wants to do. So the categories she picked are building and personnel security, or personnel, yeah. Sorry, it's very small on my screen. Emergency management and prevention, leadership, and customer service. So far, we have a pretty consistent story about security. These are all very much related to security, and it breaks down, look at these accomplishments that I have related to these areas that are very related to security. So making a very strong case for herself so far. Then we get down to employment history. And so this is different from the previous format because we are listing employment history and we are including dates. It's just not going into detail about which skills came from where. And so what you see here is infantryman, valet, bartender, military experience. What do we not see here? A security officer position. There is no job title that this person has had that has the word security in it. But by the time the employer gets to that piece of the puzzle, she's already made a strong case for herself to say, yes, I do match this position. And so if she had used a chronological resume, that employer would have seen first thing, oh, well, look at the recent work history. This isn't going to be a fit. By doing it this way, we're moving the spotlight again and moving that spotlight onto look at all of these relevant skills and experiences I have. And I've worked in these situations as well. And then of course at the end is education. And both of these are quite relevant as well. So that can be helpful as well. For career changers, this might be a good option for you because it's a way to say, yes, I have the skills for this and to put the spotlight right there. All right, so those are a few of some basic formats. We'll very briefly here go into the parts of a resume, but real quick, I'd like to see in the chat, any of you recall any sections that you saw on every single format of those three we looked at, even though they were different from each other? Any sections that you noticed were there every time? I see objective, name, contact information, education, summary, job history, company titles. You are all on top of it. Yes. So yes, they all started with contact information block. And some good tips for putting your contact information in. Ideally, use your full name. Try to avoid nicknames. That can come later when you're working there. Um, these days, it's pretty much agreed that you don't need to include a full street address anymore. Um, for one thing, if, say, somebody who has printed out all of the resumes for all the interviews that are today, and they comically collide with somebody and the papers go flying and someone else picks it up, now they have access to your whole address, along with your contact information and your name. And so, just for security reasons, some people prefer not to put the full street address. The application will still request that, but then that's going directly to the employer. As a best practice, we encourage you to pick one phone number. Even if you have multiple, it can be very easy to think, oh, but I'm making it easier for the employer. So that way, if they can't get me on phone number one, they can call me on phone number two. That can be a little bit confusing for employers. So ideally, if you can, pick one that you know you'll be able to answer most of the time. You also don't need to label it as home phone or cell phone, especially if it's the only one. What the employer cares about is that it is the one where they'll be able to reach you. Also, I would be curious, this is a rhetorical question. You don't need to answer in the chat. When is the last time that you listened to the voicemail recording of your message on your phone? For me, it was quite a while. And for many people, it's quite a while because we set it and we forget it. I would recommend if your answer to that was to make sure go in and listen to it and just make sure that it is still representing you the way you want to be represented, especially the way you want to be represented to employers. Goodness knows I have heard some things over time. We've had songs that have lasted a full 2 minutes, and there have been the sounds of just being jostled around in someone's pocket for 2 minutes. And so I would encourage you to make sure that you, sorry, are aware of what your recording says and how it's representing you. And finally, for email address, you want to keep that professional too. I'm not saying don't have a personal address that has an inside joke or something in it, but if you are still really wanting to keep that one, I'd encourage maybe creating a second one that has just some version of your name and try to avoid numbers that appear to be the year of your birth, even if they're not. Just don't want to cause employers to have any unintended biases. So you don't have to get rid of your groovygirl2005@gmail.com, but I would encourage you to have a separate one for your job search. And that also can help keep those employer emails separate so that they don't get lost if your inbox is very full like mine. And finally, if you have an active LinkedIn account, I would encourage you to include the LinkedIn, the profile web address. That way an employer can go in and check you out. All right, next up is the intention, which can be an objective or a summary. And you want to make sure that that is very specific to the position you're applying for. That if you don't change anything else on your resume, I'd encourage you to tweak where you can. But if you don't have time to change anything else, update the objective or summary to fit the position. Because if the employer doesn't look at anything else, they're going to look at that. And another way to make it specific is to make sure that you are being specific about what you're looking for. If you're saying, I'm seeking a challenging position with a growing company, that may be true, and that's a perfectly good thing to want, but that's not specific. That can be a letter to anybody. And so be aware of what you are looking to do with that position and how it describes itself, and make sure that you are stating your intention related to that position, not just in general. All right, next up, we have the professional experience, which is a little bit different on the chronological resume versus on a skills-based resume. But when you are doing that, want to make sure on a chronological resume that you're listing your most recent employment first and determining how far back you should go. You can include volunteer experience as well. You just want to make sure you're indicating that properly. And on a skills-based or a combination resume, again, that's very flexible. And so you want to make sure that you are looking at that job description and deciding on what type of qualifications you're highlighting so that you can match it accordingly. And finally, education. You guys got all of them. For education, if you have any post-high school education, you don't need to list high school on the resume. It is assumed that you needed to complete high school in order to access that next post-secondary education. So all you need is the post-secondary. Also, dates are optional. Just know that education dates can suggest your age and how current your academic knowledge is. And so take that into account. And sometimes you might want to leave those dates off the resume. And plus, you're probably going to have to include it on the application as well. But again, the application is a screening tool. This is your marketing tool. And so that is up to you. Especially if it was more than 5 years old or something like that, then you probably don't need to include the date. If the position you're applying for is not related to what you majored in or what you studied, you can just state the degree that you got without stating what it was in as well. So that is up to you. And then you can list training and continuing education as well if it's relevant to the work that you are seeking. Something to keep in mind is that unlike the higher education, like the formal education like that, if you are putting in certifications or licenses, especially if they can expire, I would encourage you to put dates for that, just so the employer can see, yes, this is current. All right. And then as far as other sections, there are many others you can include. Those were kind of the core four, but you can include any of these listed sections or more. Like I said, that additional relevant experience section can be really helpful if you have a lot of experience that you're trying to parse out. So ultimately, the rule for any additional resume sections and information is just to make sure it is relevant. And so as same thing with awards, recognition, hobbies. Is it relevant to the position? And just be cautious of including affiliations that could be polarizing. If you worked on a political campaign, if you were involved with a religious organization, that's not to say that there is not value in that or that you shouldn't include them. It's entirely your prerogative. Just be aware that depending on the company you're applying for, you don't know who's going to be reading the resume. And again, you don't want to provide any information that they can't legally ask about before they can ask about it. So that is just something to keep in mind depending on your background and what you're looking to do next. All right, before we jump into accomplishment statements and the home stretch, any questions in the chat?
Lots of questions coming in for you, Vanessa.
Oh boy.
I've answered a
Okay,
few in the chat.
great.
Um, so a couple of people have asked, how long should a resume be? 1 page, 2 pages, 3 pages?
What I usually recommend is for a standard resume, so not like a federal government resume or an educational CV. I would say up to 2 pages is perfectly fine as long as you have substance to put there. The 1 page is might be good if you're earlier in your career, and if you going onto a second page would be just kind of adding things to add things. But if you've got substantial career behind you and you have a lot to talk about that's relevant to the position, 2 pages is absolutely fine. Once you get past 2 pages, I see that as going a little bit long. But again, that can vary based on the fields that you're applying in.
Okay, we had a few questions about LinkedIn.
Mm-hmm.
If you include your LinkedIn, how do you make sure your LinkedIn reflects your resume if you are altering your resume for each position that you're applying to?
The age-old question. Yes. So LinkedIn works differently than that because that is more static. Yeah, it is not reasonable to ask somebody to be updating their entire LinkedIn profile every time they update their resume. I won't go into that today, but I would encourage you to come back in a couple weeks for the internet and social media and LinkedIn workshop. That'll be 2 weeks from today. And then they'll really go into more kind of how to leverage your LinkedIn profile as you're going through the job search. Or you can set up an appointment at one of your career force offices. And then we do LinkedIn profile review as one of our options and can talk through some of those areas in more depth.
Okay. And what would you say is the benefit of including your LinkedIn profile?
Employers check. They do. I think sometimes they might look and see, okay, does what is on the resume match what's on the LinkedIn? Sometimes they might find a point of commonality, like, oh, you're an alumni of that school, so am I, or what have you. But they do check. And so I would recommend just keeping it up to date and linking it if you can, because and now it's part of the process for many
Mhm.
employers.
And then what are your thoughts? What if your profile doesn't match the job you're applying for? Say you're applying for a more junior role than, what your LinkedIn profile reveals.
Then I mean, again, it's a different tool. So I would refer you to the other workshop that's more focused on LinkedIn, or to meet one-on-one. Because again, a LinkedIn profile is more static than a resume. A resume is much more fluid. And the LinkedIn profile it is up to you what you include on it, but it is going to be this is you professionally. And it's not necessarily a deal breaker, but it is. I think that if you are applying for different positions, if you're applying for wildly different positions than you had before, maybe you might want to look at updating the LinkedIn profile to see to reflect more of what you're looking to do. But again, I will leave that for the LinkedIn teacher in 2 weeks.
Okay. And one more question about fonts.
Mhm.
So they're asking what's the best type of font? The non-ornate, you know, type is probably best. But someone
Mhm.
is mentioning that they heard that Comic Sans is easiest on the eye to read and is the only dyslexic friendly font. Is that something to consider?
It is something to consider, but I would also be aware that Comic Sans kind of has a reputation, and it's sometimes not seen as a very serious looking font. Um, do what works best for you. You can also look up other fonts that are friendly for dyslexia or that are easy on the eyes to read. I think Gil Sans is one that I've read about that is a good fit, and generally sans serif is seen as generally easier for our eyes to process. All right. So we have 5 minutes left because you guys have been beautifully engaged, and I appreciate that. So we are going to head down the slide for the last 5 minutes here. So let's talk about accomplishment statements. When I say accomplishment statements, I'm referring to the bullet points on your resume, and it is what we would recommend instead of just listing tasks that you have done. And so, again, rather than responsible for this task, an accomplishment statement might look like uh, completed this task in this way and got this outcome. And so it personalizes it to show not just this is what was assigned to me, but this is the job that I did. This is how well I did it. This is what you can expect from me. And so what I'd recommend, if you do look at your resume and you see the words responsible for or responsibilities included, my humble recommendation would be to banish that from your resume, because that doesn't speak to your unique experience. Rather than responsible for taking inventory, took inventory, and then expand on that. So that is what I would recommend there, because that just is more powerful and is more active. So I won't go into a whole activity here, but I will do, and maybe you can do this while I'm talking here, is there are a couple of tasks here that just show very simple. Here are some tasks that were done. If you want to, you can give a go to try and turn these into accomplishment statements, perhaps using your imagination to do so if you've not done that type of work before. But what could turn these into stronger accomplishment statements? And so if you decide to do that, I can talk about it while you're writing and while you're working on it. But ultimately, you want to make things specific, make them quantified. And so that could be asking yourself some journalistic questions. Who did I do this task with? What was the focus? When, during what time was this happening? Was it happening during a time of transition? Was it happening during a time of restructuring? Why was this being done? In what situation did I do this work? For what project? For what system overhaul? For what software transition? Why were you the one that was doing it? How often did you do it? How well did you do it? And so by thinking about some of these specifics, that's what can turn a basic task into an accomplishment statement. And so these are some examples of how these could change. And what you can see is the difference is from a basic task that says nothing about how well you did it to a whole lot more information and not that many more words. So again, you will receive these slides and you will receive this recording. And so I would encourage you to try out making some accomplishment statements of your own as well and see how it feels. All right, finally, in the home stretch here, we'll talk very briefly about cover letters. You may have heard many things about cover letters. Some might say you got to have one no matter what. Others might say no one looks at these anymore. The answer that we like to say is it is good to have one. I would recommend having a version of your cover letter on hand that you can tweak as needed. So that way, if a cover letter is optional or you can provide one, do so. So I would recommend using the same name and contact information block as on your resume and address it to a specific person whenever possible. If you can't, then dear hiring manager or to the company name hiring team can work perfectly well. Also, I would recommend when you are writing your cover letter to avoid what we call the I trap. You don't want to start every single sentence with, I did this, I am this, I know how to do this, because that can start to, as you're reading it, to feel like trudging through thick mud. So make sure that if you are noticing that on your cover letter, that you are going back and making sure that you're varying how you're writing it now and then. A cover letter, ultimately you want it to be short and to the point. And so you don't want it to be more than 3 or so paragraphs. And so very much like a resume, you want it to be focused, you want it to be easy to read, and you want it to be related to the position that you are applying to. And you want it to have no mistakes. So, speaking of, with resume reviews and cover letters, if you have been looking at your resume and cover letter a lot in your job search, it may no longer look like words. And that is where we come in through Career Force. We would be really happy to look over your resume and or cover letter for you, with you, so that you can make sure that you're really presenting yourself well in that first step as you connect with an employer. And so I encourage you to reach out. We are happy to help. And to also check out some of the other workshops in this series. I have saw some questions about LinkedIn and some questions about interviewing. And so I would encourage you to keep coming back. We've got some great topics for you. All right, so we are a minute over. I thank you for sticking with us here. Thank you so much for joining us today. And I hope that you got some information that was new to you, valuable to you, meaningful to you. Again, you will be receiving an email by the end of the day tomorrow that will have the slides and speaker notes and recording and other resources that we talked about today. And so I hope that you have a wonderful day. Thank you so much for joining us.